Hello and welcome to the latest EnvCast episode. EnvCast is a Society for the Environment podcast, bringing you environmental professionals in conversation each month. Each episode is designed to provide insight into the life of registered environmental professionals, featuring experts from across a wide range of sectors and disciplines. We explore what they do, why they do it, how they got to where they are now, and their future ambitions. Each guest has verified their environmental credentials by achieving Chartered Environmentalist, Registered Environmental Practitioner, or Registered Environmental Technician registration. To learn more about the Society for the Environment or our environmental registrations, please visit socenv.org.uk. That's SocEnv.org.uk. Enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to this month's EnvCast episode. My name is Phil Underwood. I'm the Engagement Manager here at the Society for the Environment. Before I introduce our special guest today, I'd like to highlight that the 2023 SocEnv Awards opens for nominations on the 2nd of February. So this is your opportunity to showcase your outstanding work in recent months. You could well be the 2023 Environmental Professional of the Year if you just head to our website to find out more information. But back to this month's EnvCast. Today, I am pleased to be joined by a Chartered Environmentalist I met at the SocEnv Awards and Lecture event way back in 2018. You could say that they work for the food sector, but maybe not how you might expect. And they gained their Chartered Environmentalist registration in 2016 with the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, who you may well know as IEMA. I'm very pleased to be joined by Georgina Stickels. Thank you very much for joining us, Georgina.
Hi, Phil, and it's really great to be here today.
It's good to have you. As always on EnvCast, to start proceedings, I'm going to hand over to our guest to give us a bit of a flavour of what you currently do for your job, if that's okay. So I'll hand straight over to you.
Thanks very much, Phil. I have been for the last 12 years working with the United Nations World Food Programme. It's a humanitarian aid agency, the largest agency in the world fighting hunger. And we are engaged across around about 100 countries, feeding about 130 million people worldwide each year. And I am have been the environmental sustainability manager, the role I've just stepped down from. But I have to say, if you'd asked 27-year-old me getting started in the environmental profession, starting my master's and dreaming of the job that I would one day hold, it has been this job, and it's been the most enormous privilege to really lead the creation and the embedding of an environmental management function in a big global organisation whose work is mostly in developing countries.
Well, speaking of geography, I think we should probably mention this, but where are you currently calling from?
Okay, I'm home visiting my family in Australia at the moment, okay. But I am at the moment, I'm still working for WFP, but I've just recently taken on a new role, which we can perhaps talk about a little bit later, yes. Working in Nairobi in Kenya.
Ah, I see. But you used to work in Rome, didn't you?
Yes.
Crikey.
It's been an enormous privilege. I've got to confess, my carbon emissions, my personal and my professional carbon emissions have not been the greatest over the last, 13 years that I've been with the World Food Programme. But we offset. So, what we can't eliminate, we offset and mitigate and mitigate that way.
Yeah. So, in terms of the World Food Programme, how did you come to work for an organisation like them?
I had been, perhaps it's useful to go back a little bit further. I had an earlier career in communications and had reached a point where I'd had this incredible opportunity to meet amazing people who were doing amazing things. And I just wanted to be a little bit close to the action and realised that every communications role I'd ended up doing a story, researching a piece on environmental sustainability. So it seemed a really obvious choice. I started a master's, set myself the goal of by the time I finish this, I'd really like to be working in the field, and was very fortunate, picked up a kind of the ideal swing job. It was a communications role with the environmental regulator in my hometown of Melbourne, which is EPA Victoria. I worked in stormwater management and then climate change, and Then for a while worked with ICLI, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, who are based in Freiburg in Germany. I was working in their Oceania office on environmental sustainability and capacity building for local government, on climate and water management programs. And then I took off to the UK and spent a number of years working for Atkins, but exclusively on a contract for the Carbon Trust, and ended up ended up working with a huge variety of businesses and government departments across the UK, including Government Health Service and Her Majesty's Prison Service, which led to some really interesting learning experiences, which we might be able to touch on. From there, I saw in the IEMA jobs section that the World Food Programme was looking for someone to do their carbon footprint, and I was about to run out of sponsorship. It was a global financial crisis, and I knew that I needed to be looking for another role. So I put my hand up, and I was fortunate enough to be selected. So I led WFP's first global carbon footprint in 2009. The UN had realised with some chagrin that in 2007 that we didn't know our own footprint, and we really needed to take action quickly. And so it was an enormous privilege to be able to work with colleagues right across the globe, and helping them to understand that that carbon footprinting doesn't have to be hard. It's a lot of it, and carbon management, a lot of it's good common sense. And that's, I think, for me, been one of the things that I've enjoyed most about my environmental career, is that you're bringing it into pretty much every organisation that you might work for or work with as an environmental professional. Their business is doing something else. So you need to show how environmental sustainability is a good fit for their business model, their corporate values, all of those kinds of things. And so it's tremendously interesting to then start pulling together the ways in which sustainability is also something that makes good business sense, and isn't just a nice to have.
No, I imagine a lot of environmental professionals have those similar kind of battles with businesses and organisations, and making it the right fit for those organisations, and making it worthwhile in so many different ways, not just for the environment, but from a business point of view and that kind of thing. So you went from a kind of a core environmental or sustainability role, and now you're more working in external relationships, right? Is that right? External relations? That's
right. It's been really interesting. Career's gone a little bit full circle, and I'm back in a communications and fundraising role. But what has been really interesting about working in Kenya, there is an enormous need in East Africa, as in so many parts of the world, to be looking far more deeply at sustainable food systems. Right now, as we are speaking, East Africa is experiencing its worst drought in 40 years. And in Kenya, where I'm working, there are more than 4 million people who can't feed themselves. And just to put that in context, right before the COVID global pandemic, that figure was around 740,000 people. After COVID, but before the drought, so just going back even 18 months, that was 1.4 million people, and now it's nearly 4.5 million people. So the drought has escalated really badly. And what we have seen at WFP is that when we can support farmers, not just with food aid, but with proper food assistance, and the ability to really to work with other agencies like the UN Environment Programme or the Food and Agriculture Organisation, who do some amazing research and bring tremendous technical skills, we can leverage our deep field presence to help farmers deliver sustainable food systems and sustainable agriculture. So it's been a tremendous area of learning for me over the last year and a half or so, but also really tremendous to then be able to engage donors and and government and media and other stakeholders to really come on board with this shift that Kenya and many other countries with underdeveloped or underperforming agricultural systems. So real opportunities.
Yeah, in terms of your changing role, then was it more in terms of the World Food Programme operations side before, in terms of your impact as an organisation, and now it's become more of an influencing role externally, I suppose?
On program, yeah. Engaging much more on our programmatic side of things, whereas you're absolutely right. The early work was looking at WFP's own carbon footprint, what happens to the waste we produce, especially in developing countries. That's really, really important because there isn't a truck that comes around once or twice or 3 times a week to pick up your waste and cart it off to the local recycling centre. And certainly we see that very much firsthand in Kenya, where there can be some really challenging practices just in terms of waste being set fire to at the side of the road and very, very informal management. But at the same time, in a country like Kenya, some fantastic opportunities with businesses being set up for recycling or reuse of materials. And you see this right across. There's this really strong ethos, I think, amongst a lot of people who are used to everything being reused if it can be reused. You'll see I was working a few years ago in West Africa in Senegal, and the place where I was staying, one of the hosting staff said, if you've got empty soft drink bottles or empty water bottles, can I have those please? Because my cousin washes them and fills them with peanuts and sells them on street corners. So there is this really strong reuse mentality already in so many countries, and it's really interesting to see that coming out and seeing a great entrepreneurialism and people seeing business models and opportunities to make something out of waste or to leverage technology to deliver better resource efficiency. And the challenge is delivering that at scale, which I guess is the challenge for us right across the environmental sphere.
Yeah.
We know as professionals there are great ideas out there. The challenge is how do we get the whole world doing them?
Yeah, and obviously the challenges across different regions must be range hugely. I mean, in terms of learning from those who reuse things, just as simply as that, in less developed countries, in the developed countries, we don't do that kind of thing anymore. But I suppose that's because we're so reliant on the infrastructure that we already have, but it still creates a bit of a waste mentality sometimes. Just use it once kind of thing. So we've got to learn. There's a lot of cross learning to be done, you'd have thought. And I think we've touched on this a bit already, really, but when people think about the World Food Programme, they might not automatically think about the environment, I guess. So how does the environment fit into their work? I think you've mentioned quite a bit already, really, but how does it link into the kind of the strategy of the World Food Programme as a whole?
Well, I mean, it's a really important question. It's actually one of the test questions that we've used with the legions of interns and staff that we've brought onto the team over a period of time.
Right.
What's your understanding of what are our environmental impacts going to be? So when it comes to a humanitarian organisation like the World Food Programme, the biggest part of what we do is purchase food or receive donated food. And we transport it from the mostly developed countries that are contributing it to the developing countries where it's going to be distributed. And there are a whole host of things which have also made good business sense or been really well aligned with WFP's humanitarian principles or development principles that have also had environmental co-benefits over time. So increasing the amount of procurement from other developing countries, particularly countries within a region, has also helped to keep transport costs down and transport emissions down. But there's also, and I mentioned waste earlier, and there is a huge consideration around packaging waste that gets generated when you are moving up to 10,000 metric tons at a time of something like rice in 50 or 40 kilo bags. So we're talking some really potentially quite huge waste impacts, some quite significant greenhouse gas emissions from the movement of people and items, and some really interesting solutions too. The humanitarian sector across the board is moving towards cash contributions rather than in kind. And that's fundamentally more sustainable, as well as being, having other benefits such as giving people more dignity and choice. Provide people with a sum of money, and we have the same debate about welfare systems in the UK or Australia. Is it more dignified to give people choice about how they spend that money, and recognise that people will know best what their own needs are. Do they need food? Do they need medicine? Do they need to pay for their kids' education?
Wow, there's quite a range of different things to consider, obviously. And so how do you break down that kind of work? How do you start to tackle those kind of challenges?
Yeah, look, it's been an enormous privilege to really kind of lead some of this work, and but there's still so much still to do, and certainly even after a decade, very, very proud of some of what we've done, but really still so much work to do. I joined WFP as a carbon footprinting specialist, and was asked to do carbon footprinting, and that led fairly quickly to great, can you do us a reduction program? And we achieved 10% reductions in emissions over a 5-year period, which we're really proud of, until a major conflict in one of the big countries that we had a program in meant that we could no longer deliver by road, and we had to do everything by airdrops, and just that one country. The change in modality was enough to double our emissions in a year, and it undid all the good work we'd been doing, which was incredibly frustrating. But undeterred, we just said, look, emissions would be even higher and costs would be even higher if we weren't doing this other work across the board. So we started looking at a mix of where are the emissions really huge and where can things be changed really, really relatively quickly and easily. So we identified in that first carbon neutral strategy 5 priority areas around facilities, transport, emissions from waste, but I think that came later. We were looking at lighting. We were looking at switching to renewables where it was cost effective to do so. Recognising that WFP at that time spread across about 100 countries, around 1,200 premises, more than 60% of which were 100% reliant on diesel generators for power. So every kilowatt hour that you could save was saving you 2 or 3 times what it would in the UK, for example, as the cost of generating that power was so high. It was also so much dirtier. So also relatively small actions had quite big carbon benefits. And that was something that was really important. We also wanted to look at corporate travel. The organisation undertakes a lot of mission travel, as well as attending at meetings, and then there are staff movements, rotations in and out of non-family or hardship duty stations. So looking at where you could practically and cost effectively make improvements in some of those priority areas. And then over time, we naturally started to get inquiries about, well, what about other environmental benefits? I mean, this climate stuff, we understand it's very important, but it's hard to see. But the waste outside my warehouse, I can see that every day. And so it was really tremendous to then start looking over time at how do we bring circular economy principles into looking at our supply chain, and to really work with other UN agencies and other humanitarian players to build a bit of a critical mass for this work, a bit of an appetite for this work, to engage some of the donors to the international sector. And WFP has contributed to collaborations with the United States, with the EU, to really look at how can and should the humanitarian sector be improving its environmental performance, so that as we're saving lives today, we're not harming people's prospects for sustainable living going forward in some of these very vulnerable environments.
Yeah. It's struggled to how to comment on all that, but that's a lot of things to cover for a start. And I'm going to come back to collaboration in a second, but I made a link when you were talking then about, because you mentioned about conflict zones and things like that. And we've talked about people might not think of the environment straight away when you talk about the World Food Programme. And it just made me think of another conversation I had with a chartered environmentalist who works in the world of conflicts. So the fact that conflicts are terrible for the environment, how do you work with that to reduce those impacts? The World Food Programme's main aim is to do with food, right, and distribution and making sure people aren't hungry. Obviously, you've got a lot more objectives than that, but it made me think of that. So hopefully we can link to that conversation as well within the description below in some way. But back to collaboration, you mentioned that it sounds like it must be key to success to what you do.
Absolutely.
So how much?
Absolutely.
What kind of organisations do you work with apart from other UN organisations?
Yeah, look, just getting that initial toehold in the UN system, there's been a couple of really fantastic networks across the UN. We all started as sort of sole consultants in these potentially quite large organisations, and if we hadn't all linked up and worked together, we would never have been able to have the kind of impact that we had. And it's been one of the most tremendous collaborations I've ever been part of. People, getting in touch, reaching out and saying, I saw that you had, you had a vacancy recently. Can you share the terms of reference? Or was there anyone who you didn't hire, but you would have if you'd had more positions? I'm looking for someone. So some really very open and genuine, so can you share with me the specification you did for your sustainable procurement of non-ozone depleting air conditioners in Armenia? Just some really good fun stuff, and opportunities to take one person's good idea and say, well, okay, which other agencies could benefit from this? And then, which other humanitarian organisations outside the UN? So, through working with some of the NGO agencies, and certainly some of the leaders in this field would include the likes of Mercy Corps and the Red Cross and World Vision, Oxfam, have all been engaged in improving their environmental sustainability performance in the humanitarian space. As I said, recognising that there is absolutely no point saving lives today if we're compromising people's ability to live more sustainably tomorrow.
That makes a lot of sense. Huge amount of sense.
If I can just pick up on your question about conflict too, one of the other key players in that, and when we started this whole carbon neutral, climate neutral exercise for the UN, the single biggest agency was and is the UN peacekeepers. And they have really led the way in making sure that every single one of their environmental missions is staffed by environmental engineers who are responsible for, really the equivalent of a small town worth of people in some of those bases who need power, who produce waste, who emit sewage, and in countries that don't have infrastructure to deal with it. So they've needed to bring the infrastructure in to make sure that, and there have been challenges in international response context where we've gone in to achieve something very positive, but there have been some unintended consequences. And there are a number of reports that if you're putting links into something later, we can certainly make sure that they become available. There have been some tremendous reports looking at some of the unintended consequences of humanitarian or development interventions.
Yeah.
It's something that I think becomes so important, and certainly for people who are early in their environmental career, there's always something more that you haven't thought about, and learning to expect the unexpected in the environmental space is really, really important. Yeah,
and you can't solve everything straight away. I mean, like you said about the huge amounts of different things that you have to think about when it comes to reducing carbon emissions and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's not one fix. There's so many different things to think about. And I guess if you're listening to this as a budding environmental professional, there are challenges involved, right? There isn't just one fix. Otherwise, you'd come in, click the switch to make that work, and your job will be done. But there's a lot of different things to think about. There's the transition towards net zero. Again, it's very difficult to do just by clicking your fingers. There's so many different things to think about. So speaking of challenges, we've probably mentioned a few already, but what is there any particular challenges you wanted to mention that you faced during in your role?
Gosh, where do you start?
That probably tells a tale.
One of the things that I remember from the very first footprinting exercise that we ran was we knew that we were working with people who were not environmental specialists, but I needed to collect the data in order to calculate carbon footprints. So we'd worked out the areas that we would be focusing on. It was really obvious for WFP that it would be generator fuel and, to a lesser extent, other building energy use. We would be looking at fuel in vehicles, land vehicles. We'd be looking at air travel. And we recognised that there were probably other areas like emissions from waste or sewage, but that they would come later. So we were really focusing on those three areas up front. And so then it was, how do I break this down to people who, first of all, most of them, their first language won't be English? And how do we break this down so that, and how do we work out who to reach out to within the organisation? So the first thing we needed to do was make sure the organisation had, a really great advocate at the top who could encourage all of these country operations to participate. And we had more than 90% response rate in our very first year, which was tremendous. People from Kabul to Kathmandu to Khartoum to I want to say Zanzibar, but I don't think so. But certainly to Zimbabwe and beyond, and just really tremendous enthusiasm from people. And what we realised over time is that a lot of the people who work for our organisation are nationals of that country. So we are talking about the environment in the places where they live. And they know the problems, and they are very, very enthusiastic when we say, here are some tools that we can use to make a difference. And if you can make that as easy as possible for people, then there can be, you can generate enormous goodwill and some really tremendous responses. But the first thing you have to do, of course, is get the data. And so needing to explain to people, first of all, getting the sort of the imprimatur, the mandate from within the organisation. And we were very, very fortunate. Our deputy head of the organisation said, well, my title is Chief Operating Officer, so I can be your Mr. CO2 or your Mr. Anti-CO2, really, because that's what it's all about. And so we had this very charismatic guy who had said, yes, I will make sure that if you have any country operations that are saying they're too busy for this, or that this isn't really important because we're busy saving lives, you let them know that I'll be in touch. So it was just, we had that fantastic executive sponsorship from the top level, and the goal, all of the best programs that I've worked on previously had that. So we knew that it was something that was really important to include. The Carbon Trust, when they were doing their carbon management program with private sector and large companies, having someone to do the ground level work was important, but so was having an executive sponsor. The same thing with ICLEI's Cities for Climate Protection program. So, we knew that it was a model that worked, and we knew that it would be important to do for WFP. But then the other thing was, how do you break it down? And then how do you make sense of the data that comes in? So we had some very, very high figures for diesel consumption, for example, from one country, that when I ran it past my boss, she said, no, that operation's just not that big. Those numbers look wrong. So there was a lot of, okay, send me the document that this came from, because even if it's not in English, perhaps I can work it out, as long as it's in the right script. And so it turned out that what they were sending us was the amount of money they'd spent in a currency called Central African francs, which is about 500 to the pound.
Right.
So it wasn't litres of diesel. It was, and it was orders of magnitude bigger than what we were looking for. So, learning how to ask the questions so that you got the information that you needed. Send me your litres of diesel. If you don't have your litres of diesel, send me how much you're spending. But for goodness sake, tell me which one it is.
So communication is key.
Absolutely. And we see that, through all of the work that goes through Chartered Environmentalist, and some of the other related accreditations, that communication work, that advocacy work, it's essential. We need to be good technical specialists, excellent technical specialists, but if we cannot communicate to both our senior managers and to the people who hold the information that we need to base our good quality decisions on, then we're really stuck, and we'll be challenged to make progress over an extended period of time.
One of the key competencies of being a chartered environmentalist, communication. Good. I'd like to be able to put those kind of things in there sometimes. Thinking of challenges more broadly, What's the biggest challenge that your area of work needs to overcome in relation to environmental protection? Or, well, if I put it more positively, what are the biggest opportunities in your area of work?
As I said, one of the greatest things is working with people who can see the challenges. They don't know the solutions. You start working with them on solutions. And certainly the way we always have gone into country operations has been to say, you guys know the problems, you know the situations. We've got a toolbox. We're going to work together to figure out which tools are going to help with your situation. And so one of the projects of which I was most proud was when we put in what was at the time, we believe, the largest solar-powered system into Kathmandu in Nepal. There had been a problem with rising. I'm going to go back a step. Nepal, Kathmandu had for a long time had hydropower, which was very, very low carbon, but there had been a problem with the city growing much faster than the state's ability to create new power sources. So there was a massive increase in diesel generator use, and it was affecting the air quality, contributing to bad air quality. It was significantly increasing the cost of power, including to our operation, to our officers. And it was just tremendous to get some outreach from some of the team there who said, we don't know what to do, but we'd like to do something about it. And our country director's just come up with, a chunk of money for solar panels. And we sort of tell you what, don't spend all that money on solar panels. Have you heard of a thing called energy efficiency? and so we were able to spend a tiny fraction of the money and reduce the power bill by a third before we went out to size our solar panel system. Wow. But what we put in at the time was still a 20 kilowatt system, and it was the biggest one in Nepal at the time. So interesting to then go back and do follow-ups and see how it was going, to then have the head of IT who was charged with looking after this. And she would say, and it's tremendous that we have a woman head of IT in a country like Nepal, by the way, but she would say, you can tell everyone I am the biggest convert. I thought the country director was crazy when he said he wanted to put in this technology that nobody in Nepal knows how to use. She said, but it's easier to maintain, it's more reliable, it doesn't blow up the servers, it's so many good things. So we'd found that sweet spot in terms of people with a willingness to address an existing problem and able to recognise a bunch of benefits beyond the environmental benefit that people may or may not be able to directly see.
Yeah. And that's a good example of how your work goes beyond food, I guess, as well. Because that wasn't necessarily to do with food particularly, it was to do with the energy efficiency of the area. Is that right?
Well, and power security and electrical supply security for our own operation.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. So many different facets to the work. It's good. So what is your favourite part of your job?
Favourite part of the job? Absolutely the people that we work with in country offices, and some of the most tremendous dedication. We were one of the years that we were, again, in the early days of carbon footprinting, there had been a terrorist attack on one of our offices, and very sadly, 5 of our staff had been killed. And so we, when we reached out, and at administration staff, the people who, were paying the bills and buying the fuel for the vehicles, and so we'd sort of written to the head of admin and said, look, you guys obviously aren't going to be expected to submit a carbon footprint this year. And they said, no, people here want to really do something positive. So, but can we have an extra 3 weeks? And it took my breath away. It really took my breath away. These people who are dealing with grief and loss of colleagues on a scale that you can barely imagine. No, we want to get on with doing something positive going forward. So tell us again what we need to do, and can we have a bit more time, please? Because doing something environmental is going to really help us all feel like we're getting on with the job. So absolutely, bar none, the best days are the days where we're out in the field working with colleagues, seeing the opportunities and seeing those light bulbs go on, like the colleague in Nepal, like the team in Senegal, who's, as part of their programmatic work, have been working to help install biodigesters to both provide a supply of cooking gas for the community, but also to take wastes that otherwise would break down and form methane. And, so a carbon benefit as well as an energy security benefit, again, for these communities, and enabling them to have better access to both fertilizer, which is one of the byproducts, and an income from using the cooking gas to then make food that the women could sell. So income streams for women and for men. And so it's been really tremendously interesting, I think, over the last few years to see the way Society for the Environment and some of the other agencies, enabling professional bodies, have embraced environmental and social sustainability together. And certainly it's something we're seeing a lot more of. That this recognition that it doesn't have to be either or. It's like the old chestnut, but doing environment's going to be expensive. It doesn't have to be. And I used to get up in front of country directors and say, if we have an environmental solution that won't pay for itself over the life of the project or the asset, we probably haven't found the most sustainable option yet, and we should keep looking. And so this recognition that it doesn't have to be either or. You don't have to spend a lot of money to improve the environment, although some solutions do need an investment of time and knowledge, and sometimes and often cash, at least upfront. But that also you don't have to say, well, it's about labour rights or the environment, because we can be looking for options that the real intellectual pleasure that comes out of this work, I think, is finding those sweet spot initiatives that save people time and the organisation money, and they're better for the planet. And when we as professionals can really harness that, I think we're really optimising the potential for impact from our profession.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask this question. I think I know the answer to this now. Do you feel like you make a difference in your role?
Yes, I think our team and some of the people that I've been privileged to work with have absolutely been able to punch above their weight. But gosh, there's still so much left to do.
Yeah, but as you mentioned in the previous answer, you when you're working with people who are so dedicated, it must. The impacts must continue to roll out beyond them, and that must be pretty positive to go to work to every day.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that said, every organisation and every professional listening to this will know, every organisation has somebody in it who thinks that the environment is something that's nice to have, and it's not really, it's not really necessary, or that it is expensive, and they're still trotting out some of those old myths. And certainly we've had our fair share of people who we've needed to work really hard to convince. We weren't all just a bunch of idealistic tree huggers. And what I will say is that it's where having something like chartered status to fall back, to make reference to, has been really, really helpful, because it's very clear that we are talking about scientific method. We are talking about, making decisions based on really good data, and having an approach and having a knowledge base and means for assessment and consistent values that really do need to stand up. And in the same way as people respect a chartered accountant, a chartered engineer, to be able to say, no, we're chartered environmentalists, has been tremendously important.
Well, from the Society for the Environment, that is very nice to hear. So it's good to know. It's good to know. But let's step back a couple of years. When did you first develop an awareness of the environment and the possibilities that change could be made?
Oh, a long time ago. I was very, very lucky. I grew up on the outskirts of Melbourne in Australia, and in an area that was a designated, what was called a green wedge. So it was an area where development of forested hills needed to be managed very, very carefully because of the outstanding conservation value of that landscape. So I was involved from the age of about 16 in a campaign to protect from unfettered development an area that included the nest of a nesting pair of wedge-tailed eagles. And it was a tremendous opportunity to sort of go along and support the work of people who'd been doing this, far, far longer than I'd even been alive, and who just, it was an amazing thing, an opportunity to learn from people and to see how you go about not putting a stop to all development, but negotiating a development, between the state government, the development sector, the property development sector, and the local council authority, and the local conservationists, and looking at how a solution can be arrived at that protects the nest, means that the developers don't lose money, and having then government engaged in recognising the importance of taking these steps and making sure that protection happened. So I was about 15 or 16 when I started becoming involved as an activist, and it kind of grew from there.
You became a chartered environmentalist in 2016. Yes. For a few years, and you'd had a few years under your belt in terms of working in the environmental sector at that point. What does being a chartered environmentalist mean to you now?
Look, it was tremendously important in the work that we were doing at WFP for two reasons. First of all, as I said, having that national and international recognition that the advice that I was giving, or that our team was giving the organisation, was based on sound methods and methodologies and internationally recognised processes, was really, really helpful in addressing some of the misgivings or hesitancy that senior management might have had. The other thing is that I was relatively young. I was 35, and when I joined WFP, and I was the most senior environmental person in the organisation. I really, really needed that network, and long before I even secured my chartered status, being involved with IEMA as an associate member, having access to that information, starting to build that network, making sure that I was keeping my own skills up to date, and being able to advocate, sharing research and knowledge with my own team, with colleagues at other UN agencies. It was absolutely essential, because I didn't have a mentor at work who I could necessarily go on with. One thing I will say, I sweated long and hard over my IEMA accreditation. And one thing that I would say to people who might be looking at, is, am I really ready for this? I think I worked on it on and off for about 3 years. Just get on with it and get it done. Just get on with it and get it done, because the rewards once it's in and you've got that that sign off, it's the best feeling, and it's absolutely invaluable. And so, back yourself and go ahead, complete the process.
There's the call to action right there. Thank you very much for that. I really like what you said about the mentor situation. You work for an organisation that isn't necessarily purely environmentally focused. See what I mean? But there is certainly, within every other organisation, there's environmental work to be done. But where do you find your mentor? And being involved with someone like IEMA or whoever it might be, one of a membership body. There'll be mentoring schemes. There'll be just networking opportunities to be able to talk to people about your skills, and you'll get an idea of where your skill levels are at, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Well. It's not just
absolutely.
It's a case of learning from them as well, but you can kind of match yourself against these people who have got maybe they're chartered environmentalists already. Well, that must fill you with a bit of confidence, I suppose.
Yeah. So one thing that I would say, because I had a tremendous mentor, I was hired by someone who was an environmental engineer. So I joined the organisation, and when she moved on, it was where I really felt that this is becoming really important. I need to crack on and get this piece of paper, get this recognition, and I really need to start immersing a little bit more in. Engaging a bit more in some of the events, and I need that drive for the continuous professional development, because people are looking to our team now to be authoritative on some of this stuff, and we need to be sure that we're basing that advice on the latest knowledge and thinking and research.
Yeah, and does the fact that you or some of your team have chartership, does that help towards the trust that you can give? You have this,
and the credibility. Absolutely, it enhanced our credibility.
Good. So have you got any other pointers for budding chartered environmentalists before I move on?
Absolutely. So, yeah, first of all, just get engaged early. Looking at your career and your career progression, get as wide a range of experiences as you can early on. Build the breadth of that toolbox. Understand the cultural drivers that help organizations change. Understand the technical drivers that individual industries might be facing, or the business models that they might be working to. Build all that up as broadly as you can, whether that's through consulting, whether that's through working for, say, a national program or a statewide program where you've got lots and lots of different entities participating. But, get that broad experience early, because you'll be able to then apply that. And even if you have to go back to first principles, like the fact that you're operating in a country where there's no waste legislation and no landfills anyway, and you're able to then bring that knowledge that you've built to the problem solving that is it's the everyday bread and butter, but it's also the most rewarding part of a career in the environmental profession.
Good foundation is a good idea. Yeah. So let's look to the future. This is quite broad, but what's next for you?
We're in the process at the moment in my organisation of putting together a strategic plan for the next 5 years for our work in Kenya, and it's just been tremendous to see that work on food systems really gain traction within Kenya and right across the agricultural development sector. We had a food systems summit a couple of years ago, and there's this growing recognition that just producing more food is not enough. We need to produce food in harmony with nature, because otherwise we're going to compromise our ability to keep producing food. And that obviously relates to a whole host of areas, whether that's, making sure that we're maintaining bee populations, whether it's helping farmers in arid areas with switching to different crops that might be less water intensive in areas that can expect to receive less rainfall. It's opened up for me a whole area of, a whole new area of environmental interest and expertise, because I'm not a soil, I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a soil expert. I'm not an agronomist, and so it's super exciting, because I'm learning that there's still so much more for me to learn in this space, and it's tremendous. Then being really on the coalface, I'm 18 months into a 4-year deployment, and so there's a lot of learning still to come, and it's pretty exciting.
Which links back very nicely to your answer to, do you make a difference? You'd want to make more difference. And
absolutely,
still lots to learn, still lots to do. That's good.
Yeah.
Now, a question we ask for every one of our guests on EnvCast. If you were able to influence world leaders for a day, what would be the first thing you would do?
Seriously, just convince them that it's not a zero-sum game. Anything that you want to address, do it in a way that also addresses other problems.
Yeah. Everything's linked.
Everything's linked. It doesn't have to be the environment or the economy or the good of the people. Find the solutions that strive to deliver all of those things, because they are out there. They do exist.
Yeah. And sometimes they can ask the expert, can't they? Yes. Good. So thank you very much for joining us today, Georgina. It's been very, very nice.
It's been a pleasure.
It's like you said at the start, it's been a while. It's been a while since we last spoke. If you wanted to follow in Georgina's footsteps by becoming a chartered environmentalist and showcasing your environmental expertise, if you check out the IEMA website, that's the route that Georgina went down. Go to iema.net. That's IEMA.net. Next month, we hope to hear the insights from a chartered environmentalist working in water catchment management. So I will see you then. And once again, a huge thank you to Georgina.
Thanks very much, Phil. Great to speak with you again.
Thank you for listening to today's EnvCast episode. If you'd like to hear more about the Chartered Environmentalist, Registered Environmental Practitioner, or Registered Environmental Technician registrations, please look at our resources available at socenv.org.uk. Alternatively, visit our YouTube channel, where you can find a variety of environmental webinar series registration guides, and various insights from registrants themselves. Just search for Society for the Environment on YouTube. To keep up to date with what's going on at the Society for the Environment, you can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @SocEnv_HQ and via LinkedIn by searching for Society for the Environment with SocEnv in the brackets. We will release a new EnvCast episode on the first Wednesday of each month, so if you're interested in future podcasts, please do subscribe. You can subscribe and review through a variety of platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Castbox.